Lost Dog by David Longhorn. Jogging. It felt like a punishment for some heinous crime, not an enjoyable way to lose weight and get fitter. By the time Mark had made it to the beach, just half a mile from his bungalow, he was sweating freely. His feet were hurting, his lungs were burning, and he felt the beginnings of a stitch in his side. Gulls wheeled overhead, on the watch for prey or discarded junk food. Their screeches seemed to mock Mark's pretensions to athleticism. Overdoing it, he thought. First run of the year, after a winter of rich food and too much booze. Need to pace myself. He stopped just short of the steps that led from the promenade down onto the beach. Catching his breath, he looked out at the vista of sand, shingle, and a few rocks draped in seaweed. Taking deep lungfuls of air, he tasted the tang of the seaside. He had timed his run to coincide with low tide, so that he could pound along smooth, damp sand. He had forgotten that the stink from the various rock pools would also be present. That seaside smell. Victorians called it ozone. Didn't someone say it was just rotting seaweed, really? The thought of rotting organic matter conjured up unpleasant images, of drowned mariners and decayed bodies washed up on the tide. The storms of the winter had been frequent and intense. Harbor defenses had been damaged, boats wrecked, a few reckless people swept away. Vast amounts of debris of all kinds had littered the beach for weeks. Mark shook his head, took some more deep breaths, then started to jog again. The tide had done its work and left most of the sand pristine. There were no major obstacles. He was determined to manage a basic 2 miles this morning, and that meant pounding up the beach to the cliffs just below the old lighthouse, then back. Easy peasy. I can do it. After another 100 yards, he was not so sure, though. Again, he found himself gasping and sweating. Moving onto the soft sand from the concrete of the promenade had not made his feet feel any better. And the stitch in his side was still threatening to spoil his unambitious fitness program. Mark slowed down, casting a glance around to see if any other early risers could see just how fat, red, and stupid he must look. There was nobody around. It was not long after dawn on an April morning that threatened rain. Perhaps all the other would-be joggers had looked out the window, turned over in bed, and decided to get an extra hour's shut-eye. Sensible chaps, he thought. But then he saw evidence that he was not alone. A brownish shape appeared, far ahead, midway between Lighthouse Point and Mark. It soon resolved itself into a dog trotting along, just above the titterline. Where there's a dog walker. Mark scanned the beach ahead for signs of the animal's owner, but could make out nothing even vaguely human in shape. The dog, meanwhile, continued to head towards him. When it was about 20 feet away, it stopped. Mark continued to jog gently forward, then slowed to a walk. He liked animals, appreciated their individual characters, their capacity for trust and affection. "Here, boy," he said coaxingly, stopping so as not to spook the dog. "Here, boy." The animal stood looking at Mark, its head cocked to one side. Mark made encouraging noises, then hunkered down, reducing his size. He knew that was a good way to make animals less nervous. But this one was not inclined to trust him, it seemed. And still no owner appeared on the beach beyond. Odd. Maybe it's a stray. As Mark studied the dog more closely, the notion that it might not have an owner nearby grew more plausible. It did not look quite right, somehow. He could not tell what breed it was, so he presumed it was a mongrel. Average-sized, with a black and tan coat, the dog had an overlong, ragged-looking tail and rather stumpy legs. Its head, too, seemed oddly proportioned. It was lopsided, in fact, with one eye shoved an inch or two down and to one side by a bulge on the animal's skull. Oh God, the poor thing. The dog was deformed, perhaps as the result of abuse or disease. Mark felt a surge of pity, followed by anger. He was always outraged by the cruelty his fellow men could inflict on helpless beasts. Mistreatment of dogs, in particular, offended him. He spent too much time traveling for work to keep a dog of his own, and this only added to his righteous indignation when others abused canine companions. "What's happened, boy?" he said. "No wonder you're nervous." The dog seemed to hesitate, took a step towards Mark, then another. He reached out a coaxing hand, inviting the dog to lick his fingers and establish contact. But the animal seemed to take fright, its wonky eyes rolling in panic as it leapt skittishly away. "It's all right, I'm not going to hurt you." But the dog was already heading back the way it had come. Mark noticed then that it had no collar, but that there was some kind of leash trailing from its neck, just long enough to leave a narrow groove in the sand. A greenish-brown cord? No, more likely a piece of string that had become damp and stained with seaweed. Mark envisioned a homeless person, perhaps a violent alcoholic, dragging the hapless beast around as a prop for use in begging. Not fair, he chided himself. Plenty of prosperous homeowners are complete bastards when it comes to pets. Mark stood, unsure what course of action to take. The dog, which had glanced back several times, stopped and turned to face him. Then it began to move in a wide arc, heading up the beach, keeping about 30 feet away from Mark. Torn between two impulses, he thought. A desire for human contact, friendship, and fear that I'll prove to be as brutal as its owner. The dog reversed direction, heading back to the tide line. As it did so, it gave an odd bark that sounded somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The animal's expression, now as Mark thought about it, was quite funny. Its deformity, however tragic, gave it the look of a comedian expressing mock surprise. Smiling, Mark found himself thinking of an old nursery rhyme. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. "Well, you do what you like, mate," he said. "I've got to get on. Need to get home, take a shower, and eat breakfast." Mark resumed his run towards the point, again jogging at a very gentle pace. The dog continued to zigzag ahead of him, keeping a stone's throw away, looking back as if to make sure Mark was following. After a couple of minutes, Mark could make out the jumble of rocks at the base of the cliffs, and the gaping mouths of the sea caves beyond. The caves, he recalled, were only accessible for half an hour or so at low tide. Somehow, the thought of getting any closer to those dark apertures made him uneasy. The nursery rhyme had churned up a host of other childhood memories, including fears of half-open cupboards, and the dread of monsters that his younger self felt sure must lurk under the bed. The stitch began to assert itself again and he began to slow down, thinking to cut his run short and to hell with his fitness program. "Sorry, doggy, I'll have to bid you farewell," he said. "Hope it works out for you. Hope you get home, or find a new one that's nice." Mark stopped, bent to clutch his knees and catch his breath. When he looked up again he was startled to see that the dog had approached much closer than before. It was perhaps 10 feet away now, and giving that odd half-laughing bark. At the same time, it kept moving back and forth, as if urging Mark to follow it. He assumed that it wanted to play. That was reassuring, suggesting the beast was not hurt, but Mark simply did not have the time now. "I can't play with you, doggy," he said, hoping his tone of voice would convey his meaning. "Gotta go home. Maybe tomorrow." The dog continued its back-and-forth movement, with greater urgency now. Something about the animal's behavior triggered another memory. One of many old movies he had watched. "What is it, lassie?" he asked humorously. Young Johnny trapped down the old mine shaft. The dog tilted its head to one side as if trying to make sense of Mark's words. He felt oddly ashamed at having mocked the animal. It was as if he had poked fun at a disabled person. Again, he noticed the trailing cord, and this time he was close enough to see that the end was frayed, as if torn. Someone's had an accident, he thought. The realization brought panic. In a flash, Mark visualized any number of possible scenarios. Someone, very probably a venturesome child, had gone exploring the sea caves with his dog and got into trouble. A boy could be lying with a broken leg, or back, right now while he was making stupid jokes. Mark looked around to see if anyone had appeared, but all he could see was a faint red blob at the far end of the promenade. The blob was just perceptibly moving this way. Whoever it was, it would take Mark at least 10 minutes to reach them with no guarantee they could help. He felt the frustration, the near panic, of a 21st-century individual cut off from his hyper-connected society at precisely the wrong moment. Just then, a car sped into view along the promenade road, and was gone before Mark could even begin waving at it. Anyway, a driver would unlikely be looking down at a sharp angle to where man and dog were standing. Bollocks, he exclaimed, feeling for his phone, then remembering that he had left it on the kitchen table. My not wanting to be pestered with work emails could cost some kid his life. Okay, show me where they are, he said to the dog and started to run again, heading up the beach towards Lighthouse Point. The animal kept ahead of him, glancing back at intervals to check on Mark's progress, its tongue lolling. Despite the sense of urgency, Mark had to smile again at the creature's comical appearance. Sure enough, the dog led him over the slippery rocks towards the mouth of the nearest, and largest, cave. Mark slowed to a careful walk, then clambered onto the rock. The dog seemed to have fewer problems with the weed-slick surfaces that Mark would have expected, easily bounding ahead, and then stopping to let Mark catch up. A couple of times the man nearly fell, once catching himself with one hand and wrenching his wrist. Better not be leading me on a wild goose chase, he warned. The dog gave its laughing, gasping bark again, turned, and entered the cave. The rocks grew larger, more treacherous as Mark followed, and he realized that inside it would be almost pitch dark. He hesitated, and heard the dog's odd bark echoing against the stone walls urging him on. All very well for you, he muttered. For legs good, 2 legs not so good. The cave mouth was much higher than Mark had thought, reaching up about 10 feet above his head. He could see virtually nothing inside except an expanse of damp gray walls and roof. What if the kid is in way deep? Maybe I should go and get professional help. Call the Coast Guard, or the lifeboat service. Or just the police, they'll know what to do. The dog's gasping bark was almost continuous now, as if the beast could sense his hesitation and was growing desperate. Mark looked around again, hoping against hope that another early riser would be nearby. Instead, he saw something peculiar that he had missed during his pursuit of the dog. There were faint footprints in the sand leading towards where Mark now stood. They went one way. There was no sign that the person making them had returned along the beach. Here was positive proof that someone must have gone into the cave. So why don't I feel reassured? Mark gingerly took a few steps back over the rocks to get a closer look at the prints. They were clearly visible from a few feet above the beach, but so faint that it was not surprising he had missed them when running along the same route. They are, he thought, the prints of running shoes, and quite small. A child's, then. Or a woman's. The dog's barking was louder, and he glanced over his shoulder to see that the nondescript animal had appeared at the cave mouth. Okay, I get it, he said soothingly. Somebody brought you out for your morning walk and they made a big mistake. Mark turned to pick his way over the rocks. Again, the dog vanished into the dark interior of the cave. Mark took a deep breath and started forward, crouching despite the abundant headroom. Something about the situation seemed to require that he make himself small, try to go unnoticed. He wondered why the screeching of gulls seemed so much quieter, now. They were all far off, none circling in the updraft from the cliffs. As if they had good reason to steer clear. Wild creatures would sense danger long before the modern, urban man. That's stupid, he told himself, straightening up. Get a grip, you wimp. You're a grown man. Despite this, the old childhood memories continued to churn and roil. The wardrobe door that was never quite shut. The terror he felt at putting that first foot down on the floor when he needed to pee in the small hours. The staircase in his grandparents' house that had been so dark and steep, and impossible to simply walk down on. He had always run, dreading the imminent touch of the nameless thing he felt sure was stalking, or hovering, or floating just behind him. For Christ's sake, focus. Stay in the here and now. But in the present, too, there was unease. Something about the footprints niggled at the back of Mark's mind. His own, clearer prints had run alongside and sometimes over them. That was natural enough. But there was something else. What is it? So preoccupied was Mark with the stranger's footprints that he almost lost his own footing. Again, he caught himself, slamming his already injured hand against the cave wall. Cursing, he pulled his hand away, examined it. The flesh was not just abraded but slick with some foul-smelling gunk. He tried not to imagine what might have been carried in on the last tide, imperfectly suppressed murky visions of rotting organic matter. "Where are you, boy?" he hissed, hoping that the dog would somehow lift his spirits, make everything right with the morning again. The gasping bark sounded again somewhere ahead, but the echo made it difficult to be sure how far away the animal was. What's more, now that his eyes were adjusting to the cave's interior, Mark could see that the cavern divided about 30 feet in. The main cave continued to the left, curving away slightly. To the right, was a small cave or tunnel. It was only about 5 feet high. Nobody in his or her right mind would go in there, surely. "Where did you go, boy?" he said, raising his voice. The bark certainly seemed to come from the smaller side cave. "Oh, shit." Mark picked his way gingerly to the entrance of the smaller aperture. It seemed to slope away down into utter pitch blackness. "Anyone in there?" he shouted. There was neither a reply, nor an echo. It was as if something was damping down vibration. Seaweed, he thought. Great piles of it, probably, brought in by the tide. Whoever got into trouble probably slipped on it. Got a bash on the head for their carelessness. Mark crouched and shuffled into the side cave entrance. Almost at once, a stench of rot struck him like a blow. There must have been tons of rotting seaweed wedged inside, perhaps accumulated over years. He could see nothing ahead but darkness. Then Mark heard a noise. It was not the dog. Something much bigger. At first, he thought a person might be struggling to emerge. Yet there was something weirdly glutinous about the noise. The fetid air in the small space blew past Mark, ruffling his hair. Whatever was moving was far bigger than a man. Mark recoiled, forgetting his cramped surroundings, and banged his head on the cavern roof. Swearing, he fell over onto his ass, then shuffled out into the main cave, heaving a sigh of relief as he emerged into the feeble gray light. At the same time, as if jolted free by the shock, he realized what had been wrong with the strange footprints on the sand. They had prefigured his own almost exactly. Whoever had made them must have approached Lighthouse Point, hesitated, made as if to go back, then reluctantly started to clamber over weed-slick rocks towards the sea caves. Just a coincidence. Mark could not convince himself of that. And again, he heard the slopping, heaving sound from the side cave, louder now and more urgent. Closer. He stood and started to back off, not daring to tear his gaze from the black tunnel mouth, feeling behind him for the main cave wall. The dog emerged, head on one side, tail wagging. But even in the poor light, Mark could see that it was no longer merely deformed, but almost melted looking. It gave a fake bark that was now almost a belch, a canine impression so bad it was insulting Mark's intelligence. What had been a good approximation of a dog's coat was flowing like hot wax, changing to greenish-brown and glistening tissue. The head was merging with the body, the eyes changing from warm brown to beady black. Stumpy legs became tentacles, as did the tail, and the floppy ears. The only thing that stayed almost the same was the trailing cord that had suggested a leash. It was longer, though, and trailed back into the side cave. In the darkness of that rock tunnel something was moving, a pale shape emerging slowly, painfully, into the hesitant light. What is it? What are they? Mark's brain whirled and misfired, as it tried to make some sense of the trap into which he had walked. The dog creature that had lured him in, was it a subunit, an ally, perhaps a symbiotic partner? Mark thought of deep-sea creatures in which the male was a tiny adjunct to the far larger female. Does it matter? The bigger one might be slow, probably can't stand daylight. Just run. Mark turned to flee, but out the corner of one eye, he saw a long, pale shape lash out from the side cave. A stinging blow struck him on his already injured head and sent him reeling forward against the rock wall. The tentacle wrapped itself around his leg, a second grappled his arms, pinned them to his sides. A third coiled about his throat and started to throttle him. More sinuous limbs wrapped him in a muscular embrace and dragged him over the rough rock floor. He felt bones snap, his vision beginning to fade. Mark began to scrabble at the sand that lay between the rocks of the cave floor. Suddenly he felt a sharp pain, one so intense that it cut through his fear. A familiar shape, curved and smooth, then jagged, dangerous. A broken bottle. He grasped frantically at the improvised weapon. But his arms were pinned. A phrase drifted through his fading consciousness, coming from God knew where. Playing possum. Mark let himself go limp. At first, it had no effect. The tentacles continued to wrap him painfully tight, dragging him across the weed-slimed granite. But then he felt a slight relaxation. He gulped air desperately, gave a great heave, and freed his arm. At the same time, he twisted his head round to see what had got him. It was a writhing rosette of tentacles surrounding a circular maw lined with inward-pointing teeth. Fringing the fleshy cave of the monster was a ring of beady eyes. Mark cried in despair. The thing was too big to fight with the neck of a beer bottle. And he was going to be inside that serrated mouth in a matter of seconds. A familiar gasping laugh came from just behind him. He recalled the living bond between the monster and its decoy, twisted round and slashed with the shard of brown glass. It was a lucky hit. The smaller creature, now reverted to its hideous, true form, jerked and leapt away. A jet of inky fluid shot out from the wounded predator, spraying Mark in the face. Stinging pain forced his eyes closed. But the attack had the desired effect. The tentacles holding him lost their grip as the pain of the lesser beast confused the greater. Mark staggered upright and blundered into the cave wall. He felt blood pouring from his injured hand, tried to wipe the foul fluid from his face with the other. He could just about make out the light of the cave mouth. Behind him he heard a glutinous heaving, felt a tentacle lash his left calf. Don't fall down, don't fall down, don't fall down. The mantra of survival ran through his head as he tripped, recovered, found himself among the rocks at the cave entrance. Adrenaline could only do so much, and now the pain of the corrosive ink added to that from Mark's cut hand and broken ribs. Blood loss will kill me, or at least make me faint, then that thing would reach out, the familiar fake bark sounded close behind. He did not need to look to know that the decoy was after him. The Mark who had gone jogging at dawn could probably have kicked the thing to pieces. But he was wounded prey now. He felt his ankle gripped by sharp teeth, glanced down to see that the creature had almost resumed its dog form. He tried to kick it loose, and gasped in pain as the sharp teeth tore his Achilles tendon. He reached down and jabbed the creature in the face with his shard of brown glass. The lesser monster let go of him, and its false coat rippled, whitening in what must have been rage or fear. Black blood, not defensive ink, squirted from the lopsided face. "What are you doing to that dog?" Mark was so shocked to hear another human that for a moment he just stared blankly at the blurred form. A woman, to judge from her loud and disapproving voice, was just visible on the beach. "I will report this to the police." Mark realized how bizarre he must look, and how culpable, a blood-soaked maniac with a broken bottle fighting a mongrel. "Help me," he shouted, agony shooting through his damaged ribs. "It's not what you think, you monster," shouted the woman. "Don't think you'll get away with this." Mark saw her raise her hand, and heard a distant click and whir. "Oh, Jesus, she's taking a picture on her phone." He began to clamber towards the onlooker over the rocks. She started moving away, gathering speed, perhaps running. His eyes were still streaming from the corrosive fluid. "Keep your distance, you degenerate," she called. "I'll have the law on you, see if I don't." Suddenly, Mark realized that she was his best hope. "Yeah, piss off, you old bitch," he yelled, hoping she would be outraged and call the police there and then. "You old cow," he added, for good measure. Again, the dog creature fastened its vicious little teeth into Mark's flesh. This time it easily dodged his flailing attack, then jumped at his hand and fastened its jaws on his wrist. Screaming in pain, he dropped the bottles hard, sank to his knees, and pummeled the creature with his free hand. Having disarmed him, it retreated again, giving its gasping laugh. "Nothing like a bark, really. Should have spotted that. Too easily fooled." Mark tried to raise himself upright but seemed to be frozen on all fours. He was perhaps 15 feet from the cave mouth, hidden from anyone on the cliffs above by the overhang. He felt himself growing cold, remembered that severe blood loss produced that sensation. "Well, at least if I die out here, that big bastard won't get me." The thought was oddly reassuring. Then he felt small teeth piercing his wounded ankle again. The tugging that followed was shocking in its intensity. The small creature was vastly stronger than any real dog of its size. But it did have one thing in common with regular canines. It's a retriever. He began to kick out and scrabble at the rocks, trying to secure a handhold. Ropes of seaweed slipped through his fingers. After what seemed like hours, they reached the cave entrance, and the greater beast had secured him. The last thing Mark saw was a creature that was nothing like a dog, something like a walking squid. But it still seemed to be laughing to see such fun. "I tell you it happened right here," insisted Marjorie Allington, gesturing at the rocks under Lighthouse Point. "That awful man was attacking a poor little doggy. With a broken bottle, it looked like." The young police officer looked skeptical. "Well, there's no sign of either man or dog now," he pointed out. "Obviously, if you wish, you can come to the station. We can fill out the relevant forms." "Oh, really?" said Mrs. Allington. "Is that all you people think about? A helpless animal was being assaulted, quite possibly killed. You could at least search for some evidence. I provided you with facts." She held up her phone, showing a poor-quality picture. "That might be a man tormenting a dog," conceded the officer. "Or he might simply have been playing with it, and you misinterpreted the situation." The policeman looked doubtfully at the rocks while the woman spluttered with rage. "I don't see how slipping on the weed and breaking my pelvic girdle would help the cause of animal welfare, madam," he said firmly. "Now, if you don't want to make a formal report, shush," hissed the woman suddenly, laying a meaty hand on the officer's arm. He was about to protest when she pointed towards the sea caves. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "I'm sure it was someone calling for help." The officer frowned. He had heard something, perhaps a human voice, but the roar of the incoming tide made it impossible to be sure. "Could be a seagull," he opined. "They can sound remarkably." The officer stopped in mid-sentence as a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave, crawling on hands and knees. It was diminutive, hard to make out at this distance. But it seemed to be a child wearing some drab green and brown garments. The figure raised a hand to wave slowly, in apparent pain. "Help!" This time, the cry was more distinct. It had a pathetic, gasping quality that stung both the onlookers to urgency. "Okay," said the policeman, "you stay here, I'll check this out." Mrs. Allington stood watching as the young man picked his way over the rocks, all the while calling out in an attempt to reassure the little boy. Or girl. It was difficult to tell. The pale, almost featureless face below a mop of dun-colored hair could have belonged to either gender. "Don't try to move, I'll be there in a minute," shouted the policeman again. But his words did not have the desired effect. The small, drab figure crawled back into the shadows of the cave. This, in turn, spurred the young man to greater efforts, and he almost ran into the dark maw in the cliffside. Mrs. Allington waited, on tenterhooks, for the policeman to emerge with the poor little child in his arms. As seconds turned to minutes, she began to wonder if he had indeed suffered a fall on the slippery rocks. It was hard to imagine any other possibility. She considered calling the police, but had a vague feeling that that could be an offense, given that the police were already present. "Oh, this is ridiculous," she said to herself, and began to make her way over the weed-slick rocks. Behind her, the incoming tide started to wash away all the footprints that had been left in the sand that morning. Next story. Trick or Treat by Sarah Clancy. We were both well aware that we were too old for trick or treating. But we had 3 movies left to go in our marathon and the candy had run out. Since Cindy and I were on good terms with all of our neighbors, I figured that we would get something as long as we kept to our street. So, after tossing on some old bed sheets to give the appearance of effort, we set out. Kids flooded the walkways, moving as a chaotic stream from one house to the next and battering against our legs as they passed. It was still early in the evening, just dark enough to let the decorations shine. The mechanical growls and whirls of the more elaborate setups were barely audible under the delighted squeals as we made our rounds. While just about everyone rolled their eyes at us, they still gave us a handful or two of their candy stash, making it well worth the effort. We had more than enough by the time we had completed the loop and were headed back to our house. That's when I stopped at Mr. Wilson's house. "I didn't know that he set up a haunted house this year," Cindy said while we paused to let the stream of children pass before us. Mr. Wilson had never really been into the whole Halloween thing. Not that he ruined the fun for anyone else. Instead, he just skipped town for a few days. I studied the faces of the children as they passed. Apparently, his setup wasn't that great. They weren't laughing with their usual glee. But then, they weren't chatting about how lame it was either. I couldn't decide if that was a good sign or not. "We should go check it out," I said. Cindy gave me a sour look. "You wanted to see horror movies, and I gave you that. My charity ends there." There wasn't a person on earth easier to scare than Cindy. Which of course made her the perfect person to do these sorts of things with. If the place was too lame to offer a thrill, at least I'd have her to laugh at. "Oops, he's spotted us," I said as I returned his wave. "Can't get out of it now." Cindy alternated between glaring at me and smiling politely at Mr. Wilson as we headed up the path to his house. Trick or treat, we beamed in way of greeting. We went through the usual remarks as he placed generous handfuls of candy into our bags, but we quickly ran out of things to talk about. So I mentioned his haunted house. Mr. Wilson looked so damn proud of himself that we couldn't say no when he invited us inside. Cindy kept close to my side as we entered. But the tension in her shoulders soon faded. Dark plastic sheeting had been hung up to close the room off from the others, creating a crude maze. Dime store cobwebs with plastic spiders were tossed over a long, thin table while bed sheets hung from the ceiling, balloons plumping up their insides. Mr. Wilson further ruined any atmosphere as he ran about, organizing his costume and hitting on an old tape player. The sounds of the thunderstorm distorted as the tape struggled to move. Mostly, it just sounded like static. Cindy and I shared a glance. It seemed like neither of us could decide if it was funny or a little sad. We straightened our features as Mr. Wilson turned around. With his cloak and top hat, I supposed he was going for an old English gentleman vibe. Clicking his fingers like he had just remembered something, he crouched down and pulled a large doll from under the table. It was about the size of a 5-year-old. It had a frilly Victorian dress, and its hair was matted, with its skin shining in the dull light. Mr. Wilson held the doll close to his chest, completely forgetting to turn it around so it was facing us, and waved his free arm out wide. "Welcome one and all to our haunted house. Oh, right, this is Jessica." It didn't seem like the arms of the doll could move, so he just sort of popped it from side to side, talking out of the side of his mouth to give it a voice. He still didn't notice that we couldn't see the doll's face. Cindy and I both said hello to the doll in an effort to play along. Mr. Wilson grinned. "I've been practicing. Bet you didn't see my lips move." In unison, we lied, agreeing that we had missed the obvious movement. We couldn't bring ourselves to disappoint him. With a flourish of his hand, he took us into the next room. As we walked, he weaved a story about a haunted mansion somewhere in England. It was hard to follow since he forgot more lines than he remembered and was constantly backtracking to correct himself. The next room was just as bad. There were a few rubber bats, a sheet over the window that was already falling down, and a table set with bowls of cold spaghetti and peeled grapes. Mr. Wilson declared them to be intestines and eyes before realizing that he had forgotten to cover them. He made his apologies, juggling Jessica as he searched for whatever was supposed to be tossed over them. So we politely averted our gazes and give him some time. Cindy gasped sharply and I whipped around to face her. She had one hand on her chest and was trying to catch her breath. Over her shoulder, I saw what had startled her. A mannequin was set against the wall beside the door, dressed in a cheap doctor's costume and its face hidden behind a surgical mask. Seriously, I chuckled under my breath. "I thought someone was standing there," Cindy said just as quietly. Mr. Wilson recaptured our attention and continued with his story. I almost groaned as he took it from the top, still weaving the Jessica doll back and forth when he tried to talk for her. Even as boredom began to brew inside me, we made sure to listen patiently, chuckling and gasping at the appropriate moments. The only thing that made it bearable was the way Cindy kept sneaking peeks at the mannequin, like she expected it to move. I nudged her. She was startled just like before, this time turning to glare at me. It improved my mood immensely. "It's staring at me," she whispered. "It can't stare at anyone. It doesn't have eyes." It was hard to keep from laughing at her as we followed Mr. Wilson to the next room. His kitchen. Here, two mannequins sat at the kitchen table, each tipping at odd angles like they were about to topple onto the floor. Mr. Wilson rushed over to move them back into place. The movement was clunky, with none of their arms or legs moving at all. Each one had the same lacquered shine as Jessica. Like a well-polished table. After they were righted, Mr. Wilson began his speech about them summoning forth dark spirits with their Ouija board. It was the same urban legend I'd heard since I was 3, so I took to watching Cindy instead. Her nose wrinkled slightly as she sniffed at the air. "What?" I asked. "Can't you smell that?" she whispered back. To humor her, I took a few discreet sniffs. Under the traces of candle smoke, there was a sharp note of chemicals. Not bleach. Something else I hadn't smelled before. I shrugged at her. We were in a kitchen. It wasn't unheard of for someone to go overboard with the antiseptic. Then we were moving again, going into a little offshoot by the laundry room. The chemical smell grew stronger until it burned my nose. Cindy lifted her hand to cover her mouth. We exchanged a look, but neither of us said anything. There were 3 mannequins crammed into the small laundry room. They were dressed in cheap clown outfits with a bit of fake blood splattered across the walls, each drop statically placed for an easy cleanup off the tiles. The hallway light caught on what little of their body was left uncovered. They each had that same shiny finish, but they seemed to be older, with fine cracks appearing across their skin. Like breaks in a painting. I was trying to pinpoint what that smell was when Mr. Wilson juggled Jessica into his other arm and swept aside the curtain that he had put up to divide the hallway. The moment the plastic rippled back, a ripe stench wafted out. It mixed with the now ever-present reek of chemicals. The stench was an almost physical thing. I could feel it coating my throat a little more with each breath. Tilting my head to the side, I peered into the darkness and fought down the urge to gag. Cindy clenched my hand as her eyes adjusted enough to see the dozen of cloaked figures. All of their hoods were pulled up, leaving only their frozen, lifeless hands visible. Mr. Wilson turned on an electronic candle he had fished out of his pocket and held it out so that the light pushed a little into the darkness. The hands glistened as if they were slick. "This way," Mr. Wilson said in an exaggerated tone. Cindy's hand squeezed me until it hurt. I was about to pull away when I saw her expression. The color had drained from her face, leaving a slight greenish tinge, and she continued to swallow thickly like she was going to be sick. "What's in there, Mr. Wilson?" she asked. He wiggled his fingers. With Jessica in one hand and the candle in the other, it wasn't an easy task. "All of my victims," he said before breaking into a brilliant smile. There was something in the expression that made me cringe. It was a knowing little smirk, like a child that had a secret and was waiting with anticipation for the great reveal. I eyed the lineup of figures again. It would be easy to hide a friend in there to jump out at as we passed. "I meant the smell," Cindy said softly. Mr. Wilson's smile grew impish. He was almost bouncing on his toes with delight. "You know, I normally preserve them. But some have had the audacity to start rotting anyway. Rude, right? That's all right, though. I'm just going to start again." I waited for him to look away before I rolled my eyes and leaned closer to Cindy to whisper, $20, it's old hamburger meat." Cindy gave me a sideways look. "I don't like this." I laughed and nudged her with my elbow. "How can you be scared right now?" I had to grab her hand to get her moving again. The moment we entered the hallway, the stench became unbearable. Mr. Wilson had really gone overboard. With the mannequins on either side, we had to walk in single file. Cindy squeezed my palm, her grip tightening with every step. Using my other hand to cover my mouth, I tried to pay attention to what Mr. Wilson was saying, but it was a struggle. Every now and then, our leader would look back over his shoulder to check that we were still there. That smile remained on his face the entire time. That secretive, expectant smile. It was starting to get to me. I knew someone was coming. I just didn't know when. I couldn't take looking at that smile anymore, so I shifted my attention to the figures, sneaking glimpses at their hands and what little of their faces I could make out. Their fingernails were black. Not black nail polish, but a rotten, molten black that pressed up under the outline of the nails. Almost like a bruise. It was an astonishing amount of detail to give to something so pointless. It must have taken him hours to perfect. I couldn't pinpoint why, but it bothered me. I was grateful when we finally reached the end of the hallway and passed through the next curtain of plastic sheeting. The smell remained. Like it had seeped into my pores and coated my hair. There was no ignoring it, and I had to swallow a few times to keep myself from being sick. Cindy pressed close to my side, not faring much better. "And now, for the end of my tour," Mr. Wilson said with glee. He reached down, placing the electronic candle on the floor in favor of grabbing a small metal ring. One pull and a wind of hinges had the basement door opened. Cindy grabbed my wrist and pulled me closer. We quickly exchanged a look before studying the opening. There wasn't a hint of light, leaving the trapdoor as little more than a gaping pit. I strained to hear the slightest bit of movement. The setting was just too perfect for a jump scare. It took me a second to realize that, no matter how hard I strained, I couldn't hear a thing beyond the soft murmur of the tape recording. Even the sounds of the kids outside were gone. "Watch your step," Mr. Wilson grinned. I looked from him to the pit. Then smirked over my shoulder at Cindy. "You first." "I don't want to go down there," she whispered. Mr. Wilson stepped forward before I had a chance to tease her, thrusting little Jessica out before him. "You're scared? Here, take her with you." She was really brave. Cindy reluctantly released her death grip on my arm and accepted the doll. She took to fussing over it as a way to calm her nerves. Making sure the dress was sitting just right and trying to fix her hair. I turned back to Mr. Wilson. He was still grinning, but not at me. His eyes were on Cindy and Jessica. For the longest time, he didn't seem to breathe or move or blink. I was completely forgotten. "So," I said to break the silence, "I guess I'm first." Mr. Wilson snapped out of his daze. With a wide wave of his arms, he beckoned me closer. I took one step before Cindy's arm latched onto my wrist again. She was doubled over by the time I turned around, her hair sweeping down to cover her face. Jessica clattered against the floorboards as Cindy gagged. From my position just next to her, I could make out the tiniest slither of her face. Just enough to see her jab a few fingers down her throat. From Mr. Wilson's position, it would most likely look like she was trying to stop herself from vomiting instead of inducing it. Before I could ask her what the hell she was doing, a violent tremble ran through her body. She squeezed my wrist until I was sure the bone would crack, then vomit gushed from her mouth. The sight and smell were almost enough to take me go over the edge with her. I tried to pull away as she repeated the process to make herself sick again. "Cindy!" I snapped as a bit of bile splashed on my shoes. "What the hell?" "I'm sorry," she mumbled, lifting her head just enough to glance at Mr. Wilson. "I think it's all the candy. And the smell. I'm sorry, I should go home." The words left her mouth so fast that they almost bled together. The way she sounded made it harder for me to be mad at her. "Sorry 'bout this, Mr. Wilson," I said as I rubbed Cindy's back in soothing circles. "I'll take her home and then come back to clean this up." Tiny droplets of blood welled up along my forearm as Cindy dug her nails in. I hissed in pain but helped her to stand. "You'll be back?" Mr. Wilson asked. His unblinking stare sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded slightly. "Yeah. I'll just get her to bed first." Mr. Wilson stepped forward and Cindy inched back. Somehow, his grin stretched even further as he picked up Jessica and held her out in front of him. "Why don't you take her? She likes you." "No," Cindy stammered quickly. "Thank you. You'll need her for your next trick-or-treaters." I didn't have time to even shoot her a strange look before she started pulling at my arm. A few muttered threats that she was about to be sick again finally got me to stop resisting. We hurried down the hallway, back through the kitchen and living room, and out the front door. Only once we were crossing the yard did she let go of me and break into a flat-out run. I glanced over my shoulder to see Mr. Wilson standing on the porch, holding Jessica, ghastly smile still in place. I shrugged at him before I began running to catch up with Cindy. She was through the front door of the house before I had even made it up the driveway. "What is going on?" I said as I crossed the threshold. Cindy was in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear and knife in her free hand. "Lock the door," she hissed. The fear in her voice made me act instantly. We had locked all of the other doors before we had left, so I had expected the click of the lock to offer her some comfort. It didn't. Without turning on a light, she pressed her back to the wall, sliding down to pull herself into a tight ball. "Who are you calling?" Cindy shushed me and her call connected. The green light cast deep shadows over her face and left me uneasy. "Hello," she whispered. Her eyes darted around as she waved for me to sit down next to her. I could hear the muffled voice on the other end of the line but couldn't make out the words. It wasn't until Cindy was giving our address, as well as Mr. Wilson's, that it clicked. She had called the police. "What are you doing?" I hissed. She ignored me. "You need to send someone straight away. My neighbor has the girl that went missing. The one on the news last night." I was too shocked to respond. My mouth gaped as she continued in a rush. "No, he's preserved her somehow. He's using her like a doll." "No, no," I held her in my hands. I saw her face. Her skin chipped away in my hands. I saw bone. It wasn't a doll. All of her words jumbled over each other as they entered my ears. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Mr. Wilson had been their neighbor for years. "I think there are others," Cindy whimpered. "The mannequins had fingernails. Eyelashes. Please, just hurry. He tried to get us into his basement." "No, we're at home now." I tried to cover, but I think he knows. He knows. The thought lodged into my brain. It was chased quickly by another thought. We house sit for each other. I strained, pushing through the chaos filling my mind, but I couldn't remember if I had gotten the spare set of keys back from him. A creak of the porch floorboard made my heart stop. I grabbed Cindy's hand and pulled her to her feet. There was no time to get out the back door, so I opened the crawlspace under the stairs and shoved her through. The sound of keys clicking together made Cindy's feet falter. By the glow of the phone, I saw her eyes widen. I hurled myself in after her. There was barely enough room for the both of us, and our legs pressed together painfully as I hooked my fingers under the door and pulled it shut. Cindy opened her mouth to say something, but the whisper of hinges kept her silent. Sitting in the dark, with both breaths held, alert to every slight groan and creak. The voices of children grew and fell swiftly. It took me half a second to figure out why. The door had opened and closed. Someone was inside the house. The footsteps slow, steady. As if trying to minimize any noise. I could only faintly hear them as they trailed up the stairs above our heads. Cindy was shaking. I could see it by the tremble of the phone light that she was trying to smother against her cheek. "He's here," she whispered to the person on the other end of the line. The call seemed at once, both a protection and completely useless. Hot tears trickled from my eyes as I listened for more footsteps, desperately trying to place where he was. Mr. Wilson barely offered a sound. To the point that it seemed he was everywhere and nowhere at once. The moment I was sure he was in the upstairs bathroom, I would catch the soft scrape of shoes over the kitchen tiles. The back door would rattle, but shadows would slip through the light seeping under the door. I almost screamed when the voice called to us. Not Mr. Wilson's real voice. The one he had used for Jessica. High-pitched and taunting, followed by a giggle that set my nerves on end. He called to us in that voice over and over, trying to coax us out. Cindy flicked against me when we heard cupboard doors violently ripping open. He was looking for us. We both looked to the little door of the crawlspace. The only way I could keep it closed from inside was to slip my fingers through the gap and tug. Images flooded my head of a knife stabbing under the door and severing my fingers should I try. My mind whirled, trying to think up what I'd do if the door opened. There wasn't any room to move. I didn't have a weapon. The footsteps drew nearer, slowed, and stopped just inches from our hiding place. Mr. Wilson spoke again, keeping to that twisted, childish voice that I could have sworn was coming from right beside me. Like he was lurking in the darkness with us. Police sirens pierced the night. I never heard Mr. Wilson leave. Neither Cindy nor I dared to breathe until we heard the police entering the front door. We didn't move until the voice on the other end of the line said it was safe. Slowly, we crept from our hiding place and into the waiting arms of a police officer. It was a moment of chaos. With the officers trying to get us outside as swiftly as possible. The strain on their faces told me that Mr. Wilson hadn't been caught yet. But it was what I spotted as they nearly dragged us outside that made me think they weren't going to find him. Jessica stood only a few feet from the hatch we had been hiding in. Her mangled hair was pushed back, allowing me to see the grotesque rot that Cindy had seen before. A note was written across the front of her dress. 3 simple words that meant nothing, but promised so much. Trick or treat.